Hello and welcome, everybody. Today's program is something that is very personal to me because it is part of my own family story. When I started doing genealogy several years ago, I wanted to start with a branch of the family that I didn't realize at the time would be the most difficult branch of my family to research. So I've often thought of my mother's family as one filled with tragic deaths, many secrets. And the biggest mystery in my mother's family tree is the origin of my mother's maternal grandfather, Roy Joseph Gonzalez. So, what we'll do today is we will go over how I was able to start to untangle the identity of the Gonzalez family. Now, I did this using DNA, oral history, and historical context because the things just weren't lining up. But once I put it into historical context, things started to make a little bit more sense. So, full disclosure, 5 years on, I'm still actively researching this branch of the tree, trying to untangle the web of this family. But I can say that what we will talk about today was the beginning of my journey to climb over this brick wall. So let's jump on in. So, who was Roy Joseph Gonzalez and what was his story? Now, what we'll talk about, as I said a moment ago, is we will kind of go over what is the official story. What did I learn from my grandmother? I was lucky enough to be able to record a very, very lengthy oral history from my grandmother the year before she passed away. She passed away in 2020 of COVID. So I was able to get some kernels of information from her. Then we're going to follow the paper trail because if you do anything with oral history, you have to also follow the paper trail. So, do the records confirm or contradict what we thought we knew? Does it add even more color or information to what we thought we knew? DNA, we'll talk a little bit about how my mother's DNA was able to kind of confirm that I was on the right track. And of course, historical context. So, how can local history help us understand why the family made the decision to hide their identity? Because that's a big part of Roy's story. And this is him right here. This is the earliest photograph we have of him. I believe this would have been taken when he was in his late teens, so in the 1920s. But a lot of his story is very much shrouded in mystery and in some ways deception. But deception is not always necessarily a negative. In his case, it was a necessity. So we'll get into that shortly. So this is what we thought we knew about him. So he was born in 1911. He passed away in 1989. His mother was a lady named Lucille Wood. She said that she was born in Franklin, Louisiana, which is in St. Mary Parish. She was bilingual in French and English. That French would be, my mother called it Cajun French. Looking back, I think it was more like a Creole French. He grew up with a stepfather who his mother married when he would have been in his early teens. His name was Frank Legault. But his father, that's a big mystery here. Anytime my mother would ask her grandfather, who was your father? What was his name? What's his story? All my mother ever got was, oh, he was a Spaniard from Spain. Well, what does that mean? Because Roy was, and my grandmother by extension, very dark complected, we assumed he meant, oh, my father was Mexican. And he didn't want to say that because he's of a certain generation and this is Louisiana. So we thought maybe he was maybe indigenous Mexican or something like that. But apparently he allegedly died of epilepsy. The reason why I say allegedly is because I haven't found proof. I don't know if he ran away or died or whatever, but my grandmother said that there was a big concern that she would have epilepsy and they ran all kinds of tests on her as a child. Now, he claimed he was born in El Paso, Texas. And the interesting story about that is El Paso, if you're not familiar with the geography of Texas, that is on the other side of Texas. There is no evidence to suggest that his mother, who at that time would have barely spoken English, would have gone to the other end of Texas, furthest away from Louisiana. So it's a little strange. Now, he told people he did have a baptismal certificate because the church he was baptized in El Paso burned. That was a story he told the federal government in the 1940s when he needed to register for the World War II draft. He needed to have proof that he was a native born citizen of this country when he did it. he needed to have proof of where he was born, just period. And my grandmother told me this story about how her father went with his mother and his grandmother. The grandmother definitely didn't speak English, to some federal building in New Orleans, and they had to sign affidavits attesting to his birth. So that's a very interesting story that kind of sparked my interest in this branch of the family. Like, was this even true? But I do know he was raised in New Orleans. That is something that my grandmother was adamant about, was that he grew up in New Orleans. Now, he did have a number of siblings. He had an older sister named Mabel, who was born in 1907. She passed away in 1952. He had another sister named Agnes, which Agnes I only discovered through research. My grandmother had some memory of Agnes being brought up, that there was a child that died, so a young sibling of his. He had a younger sister named Louise. He had another brother named John Joseph. And then he had two half siblings from his mother and stepfather, Frank. So this is Yolanda, who went by Lola Legault, and Frank James Legault, who was born 1924. As for work, what we know he did was that he was a tailor and a landlord in New Orleans. In the 1930s, when the Depression hit, a lot of businesses and landlords, they were selling off their residential and commercial properties, and he bought them all for nothing. He bought a ridiculous amount of property and sent the rent really, really low so that he would always have tenants. And he made a killing doing this. I mean, he owned properties in the French Quarter. He owned a strip club on Bourbon Street. And my grandmother, as a child, had to get on her bicycle and ride around to all the different places that owed him rent, and would collect rent on her bicycle. I can't believe she was never robbed, but I digress. So what I got into next was digging a little deeper into my grandmother's story. And I also talked to my mother. So you can see them here. Here's my grandmother, Winifred, also went by Winnie, and my mom, Leslie. So when you are doing oral history, for those who haven't done it before, here are just some basic top 5 tips. First being, you want to start with open-ended questions. This is meant to encourage more detailed stories rather than a yes or a no. You want to also document the source. Always note who told the story, when did they tell it to you, under what circumstances. This can kind of help you with future verification. So, for example, my mother once was asking my grandmother a bunch of questions when she was in the hospital, and she had had a bad infection, and she was elderly at the time. And she was very confused. She thought I was a boy. Like, that's the kind of circumstances you want to make sure you have a note of, because that is going to affect the story being told to you. You also want to cross-check with other sources. So oral history can be inaccurate, it can be embellished. It's good to compare those stories to primary documents like the census and birth certificates and other historical documents. For example, as an example of a story that's been embellished, my dad's father, he would tell people that he was on the battleship Missouri when the Japanese surrendered. He was never there. He was in Manila. But he was big into tall tales. So these are things you got to kind of keep in mind, but also people forget things. We're human. Sometimes our memory can be a little skewed. So these are things you want to try to corroborate with other sources. But it's also very important to focus on the themes, not necessarily always the nitty-gritty details. Because details, like I said, they can get lost or exaggerated, but the general themes of stories often hold some really valuable clues. And it's really important to accept the inaccuracies. Oral history, like I said, is often influenced by personal bias or family dynamics. Be open to the fact that some stories may never fully align with those documented facts. So what we'll do now, I'm going to play some recordings, hopefully they play properly, of my grandmother talking in 2020 to me a little bit about her father and some of this generational silence. So let's see if I can get this to play.
Did you ever know what his father's name was?
I never really knew what his father's name. I might have known it sometime, but I don't remember it now. You know that the last name was Gonzalez. Yes. What was his first name? I don't know. when he died or how long he lived. I don't think he lived very long, though. I mean, probably he died in his 40s. They did not want to talk about their family. I mean, I can, because my mother would always say they never talk about, they never talk about themselves as family. They don't say much. She never knew much.
She said that her mother, who was born in Alabama, who definitely didn't speak French, she said that they often used French to exclude her for conversations, to exclude not just the kids, but my great-grandfather's wife. So there was something going on. And my grandmother, she always felt that her father was a big mystery. So that was part of why I wanted to dig into this family, this side of the family. So time to cross-check. So these are some of the basic sources you should be looking for to verify any story. You want to look at vital records, so your birth, marriages, and deaths, if you have them, census records, city directories, church and parish records, probates, wills, land and property records, newspapers. Man, newspapers are my favorite because they have so much information and they can be so juicy. Voter registration records, which we will look at least one. Court and legal records. So is anybody suing anybody? Did anybody get in trouble with the law? That kind of thing. Immigration records too. Tax records, employment records, military records. So we're not going to go through all of these by any means. We're going to go through a handful of them just because this story is such a big story. It's going to be really hard for me to squeeze it all within the time of this program, but we'll go through a number of these and I'll show you how I was using these to kind of chase down the truth. So one of the first records I pulled up was my great-grandfather's marriage to his wife, Claudia Crump. So a couple things to note here. They got married in 1930. So here's his name, Roy Joseph Gonzalez. He says he's born in El Paso. He's about 21. He's saying his father's name is Roy S. Gonzalez. Now make a note of that because this doesn't quite jive with other records and it doesn't jive with anybody else's story. He says his mother is named Lucille Wood, and then it gives the information for Claudia Crump's family. So this is one record to kind of just get me started. Now, the next thing I wanted to do was look at the census. Now, the 1940 census is the most recent census we have that shows Roy, his wife and kids, his mother, grandmother, and siblings all living on the same property. So this is in New Orleans where they're living. They are living, I believe this was on Bienville Street. So here we have Roy, Claudia, Winifred, Dorothy. Now, what they were living in, this was what we call in New Orleans a double shotgun house. So a shotgun house is where you can open up the front door, open up the back door, and theoretically you should be able to shoot a gun through the entire length of the house. So a double shotgun is basically a duplex. So on one side, he's living on one end with wife and kids. On the other side is his mother, Lucille, his sister, Yolanda, his other sister, Frank. So they are 50, 20, and 16. He has another sister named Louise. She had been married by this point. So her last name was Laposer at the time. She was 25. Louise had a kind of tragic story of her own. She had epilepsy and she passed away in the Louisiana State Mental Hospital. That won't be for another few years. And then his grandmother, so this is Louise Wood. So if Lucille is the head of the household of the other side of the rental, then this would be her mother, who is 75 years old. So this is a really awesome record to have so many people of the same family on one property. So after I found it, I asked my grandmother a little bit about what she remembers living with all these people. Because she wasn't that young, but she had a pretty sharp memory when we were talking about it. So let's see what she said.
Do you ever remember seeing your great grandmother? So this would be your father's mother's mother.
Let's see. They all lived together in a house. Yeah, I told Leslie that. Yes, they did. And later, and then those boys, I mean, as children got older, they married and they lived somewhere else. No, they all did live there. That was the one you just asked me about?
Her name would have been Louise Wood.
Yeah, you're talking about Lucille's mother. Yes, Leslie did mention that to me. And Lucille died first. Lucille had cancer. She died about 46 or 48. But her mother was still alive, and her mother was living in that house. And, yes, and she was a little old lady. She was very small. Very small. And I told Leslie, she had white hair. It was very small. And they took a picture of her, before she died.
Unfortunately, no one has been able to find that picture, but such detail is really interesting. So the next thing I did was I wanted to look at the next census, 1930. This is what you do if you're doing any beginning. This is how you start any genealogy project, right? You go with the census, you start with vital records. So I wanted to see what was going on in 1930. Now, 1930, they're living still in New Orleans. They're living on North Lopez Street. So here we see Frank Legault. So this would be my great-grandfather's stepfather, Lucille. So they're 39 and 38. Roy, he is 19. Now it says Royal. I don't know how that happened, but as we say, spelling doesn't count in genealogy. We also have Louise, who is, Roy's sister, his other brother, John, Yolanda, so his half-sister, and Frank Jr. So Yolanda would have been 10, Frank Jr. was 16, John 15, Louise 16, and so on. So the next thing I wanted to do was try to find all of these kids, including the oldest child, Mabel, and the adults living in the same place. But I needed a little bit more information. I needed a little bit more information about Mabel in particular, Roy's older sister. So I got a hold of her death certificate. Now, her death certificate, by this point, she had been married. Her marrying last name by this point was the name of her second husband, because her first husband died. Now, she was born November 2nd, 1908. Now, this says that she's born in New Orleans. The informant was her husband, who might not have known exactly where she was born. He's going to tell them whatever information he knows. But what I found interesting is that it said that the name of her father was John Gonzalez. So when I saw that, I'm thinking, okay, Roy is saying on his marriage record, his father's name is Roy S. Gonzalez. Maybe this is a mistake, but I filed that information kind of in the back of my mind as something to keep in mind as I would continue to research. Now, when I went to 1920 on that census, I saw a couple of interesting things. First being, they are not living in Orleans Parish. They're living in St. James Parish, which is just outside the city of New Orleans. So here we have Lucille. We have Mabel, Roy, Louise, John J., Louise Lemoyne, so Lucille's mother, and Frank Legault. It says Frank Legault is a cousin, which this is Louisiana, and this area they were living was kind of rural. If you're marrying your cousin, it's not that unusual. I don't believe they were first cousins, at least. Probably second or third, but I digress. Now, notice this last name. That's not Gonzalez. It looks to me like LeBeuf, so it's a French last name. Now, Lucille is saying that she is a widow. Her mother is also a widow. Lucille is 28 years old. I believe that this is the right family because the names and ages line up. Like, what is the likelihood that you have a woman named Lucille living with these children with these specific names that are the right ages? So things were lining up. But the next thing I noticed was in the column for race, it all says mulatto. Now, in this time frame, if you were just simply dark complected, you could have mulatto put there. But that was something I also kept in mind in the back of my head to make sure that, okay, is this a different family? So I kept an eye on that just to make sure moving forward that I am chasing down the right people. So just to give you some context as to where these places are, we have Orleans Parish over here, and then we have St. James Parish over here. Now, there were a handful of breadcrumbs that kept tying me back to St. James and St. John the Baptist parish right next door that made me a little suspicious. But the inconsistencies between records relating to Roy himself versus his siblings made me even more suspicious. So this is his older sister Mabel's first marriage record. So she initially got married in 1926 to a man named Hugh Ginter. Hugh was from Missouri, and he was actually a hat maker, and he taught my great-grandfather how to be a tailor. So he was someone that was talked about often in the family. For some reason, they called him Tex. It's kind of a strange nickname for someone from Missouri, but I digress. Now, she is saying, so she's the one disclosing this information. She is saying that she was born in Lutcher, Louisiana, and her father's name was John Gonzalez, and her mother was Lucille Wood. Lutcher, Louisiana is right here in St. James Parish. So again, not too far outside the city, right on the Mississippi River. It made me a bit suspicious. So we will see the 1910 census in just a moment, but this could be John LaBeouf. So remember on that 1920 census, the family is going by the LaBeouf last name. So maybe they changed their name. That was something that I was curious about just because there was just so many secrets. Maybe there was a name change, right? So I took a look at Roy's younger sister, Louise. I looked at her marriage record. She also says that she's born in St. James Parish and that her father's name was John Gonzalez. Roy is the only child that states that his father's first name is Roy, and he repeatedly did so throughout his life. So who is this John? Was he ever legally married to Lucille? The only marriage record I've been able to find for her, other than her marriage to Frank, was to this man named John LaBeouf. There is no John Gonzalez. So, or at least not one that I can find. So this would have been taking place in 1907 in St. James Parish. So I have a lot of questions. My next questions primarily are, can I find more breadcrumbs leading to St. James or St. John the Baptist? What records can I use to get closer to verifying those familial relationships? One of those records would actually be looking at voter registrations. Now, this is a voter registration card for Frank Legault, so Roy's stepfather. Says he's born in 1896, says he's born in St. John the Baptist. It also tells me when they moved to New Orleans. So it says, I have resided in the state since 1890. I think this is supposed to be a 6. In the parish, so in Orleans Parish, since 1923. That date does kind of wiggle around a little bit between his voter registration and Lucille's, but it's around 1923 that they moved to the city. So that's just another breadcrumb. Now, Lucille Woods, or Roy's mother, her death certificate has some additional interesting information. So he put her name down as Lucille Wood Gonzalez Legault, so very long name. It says that she was living on Bienville Street. So this address, he's living there. She's living with her son. So that's the address my grandmother grew up living at. It says that she's born in Franklin, Louisiana, which is in St. Mary Parish. It says her father's name is Thomas Wood and her mother is Lucille Lemoyne. So that verifies what that maiden name is for her mother. Interesting thing about Thomas Wood, which I didn't have a whole lot of time to include in this presentation, but Thomas Wood and Lucille Lemoyne were never married. He was married to a different woman. And Lucille and Louise, they didn't live in Franklin. They lived in another parish. They lived in St. John the Baptist Parish. So Louise, she was essentially Thomas's mistress, and he had a number of children with her. So this is from in the 1940s. So just for geography, because I like maps. So we have 2 of Joseph's siblings saying, Roy's siblings, I should say, saying that they are born in Lutcher or St. James Parish. Frank, he says he's from St. John the Baptist, more specifically Lucy. And Roy is saying that his mother was born in Franklin, which is where her father lived with his wife and children. But all the records I have found show Louise Lemoyne, Lucille Wood, and her siblings, they were all living in St. John the Baptist when she was growing up. Now, one would think, oh, that's not that far. Yes and no. There is a swamp in between these places, but you could very easily take the train. There was a ferry over here that'll take you across the Mississippi River. So there were ways of doing this. Now, another thing I want to point out, I do have Louise Lemoyne's death certificate. So this would be Roy's grandmother. It says that she was living on Bienville Street. She passed away in Charity Hospital in New Orleans. It says her father, they just know his last name is Lemoyne. They don't know anything else. I was able to figure out, which I didn't include in this presentation because it's a little complicated, but I was able to figure out that her father's name is Joseph, and he was another white Creole living in the area, married to another woman, and had a legitimate family. But he was having essentially an affair with this woman, Cecilia. Now, this is Vautier. This is not a name. The name was Beausier, which I'll show you in a moment. But I was wondering, could LaBeouf be a surname error? So I wanted to look at the 1910 census to see, is this different, right? So this is from 1920. I like to have things like this so you could, just as a reminder of who is who in this scenario. So Louise was Lucille's mother. Now, the 1910 census, at least for this parish, it looks appalling. It is really difficult to read, but I was able to kind of make out who these people are. Now, they're living in St. James Parish, which tracks specifically in Lutcher, which Lutcher had a massive sawmill operation. So it would kind of make sense that you would have people like John LaBeouf right here. I know this is really hard to read. He was working at the mill at the time, according to the census. Now, we have John LaBeouf, Lucille, Mabel, she's 7 years old. Agnes, actually, no, Mabel is 2. Agnes is just a few months old. So Roy hasn't been born yet. He would be born the following year. And then we have Louise Lemoyne. So this is Lucille's mother. There's this other guy here named Davis Woods. I believe this says brother-in-law. That's what it looks like to me. You have somebody else named Lewis. I think this is Legault. I think they misspelled it, but it's really difficult to read. But this says that this is their cousin. And then they have a lodger living with them. So John is 26, John LaBeouf. Louise is, it looks to be 20, according to that. And then we have a 2-year-old, an infant, Louise Lemoyne, she's 44. Now notice also over here, this also says mulatto. Now, starting in 1920, moving backwards, every record I saw shows that they list their race as either mulatto or black. So I was starting to wonder, okay, is this the wrong family? And also, who is this guy? Who's Davis Woods? So I asked my grandmother, if she happened to know any other family members, because I wanted a little bit more information just to see what she might remember, because it's very clear these are people who are having multiple generations living in a household. Maybe after they moved, some family members came to visit them. So as of right now, we got Louise. She has a brother. She has a son named Davis, and we know that Lucille exists. So let's see what my grandmother had to say.
So this old great-grandmother had more than just one child, like Lucille. She had this brother. I remember his first name was Dave. Seems like they would say Dave, and they had I think they had another sister, that we'd go over and see Aunt somebody. I can't remember what her name was. And she was married, and the aunt took care of automobiles, fixing them, and changing tires or something like that, And I used to like to see them because they were very nice. You know what I mean? And I had a granddaughter who was about my own age, and her name was Rosemary. And that was that part of that family. So you see that the old grandmother, the oldest grandmother, she had 2 other children besides Lucille. that I know of, that I saw, that I saw them, and I knew them real well. I just knew them. They would come up, they were like they weren't distant relatives, but they weren't, they lived on the other side of town, and they didn't come over to see me very often. But I did see them, and I knew them.
So I thought this was super interesting. So I kept some of that information in the back of my mind as I kept researching. But I will say this, at the time when my grandmother told me some of this stuff, her memory was very sharp, but my grandmother, her entire life, she liked to use way too many pronouns, like too many she's and he's. And sometimes her stories would be a little convoluted. What I find interesting, and this is something for all of you to keep in mind, is that I did this recording 5 years ago, or now going on 6 years ago. When I first wrote this presentation back in October, I was re-listening to that oral history because it's about an hour long. And I realized that some of the things where at the time when she was telling me these things, I didn't entirely understand who she was talking about. Now that I've done more research and I have more context, I know exactly who she's talking about, which is kind of interesting to me. So moving forward, I went to look at the 1900 census just to see if I can corroborate some of Lucille's siblings. So here they are down here. So we have Louise Lemoyne. She is 28 years old. She has a son named Thomas, who's 16. She has another daughter named Ava, who's 13. Lucille is 10. Her younger brother, Davis, or Dave, as my grandmother called him, he was 9. Now, we also have in the same household this woman, Cecilia Bozier. That is Louise Lemoyne's mother. She's 60 years old. And Cecilia's mother, Catherine Songi, is also still alive. She's 90 and she's also living in this house. And she has a nephew named Ferdinand Derensberg. He would have been 24 years old at the time. So they're all living in the same house together. I'm like, wow, okay, this corroborates a lot of things. It corroborates who Louise's mother is, Cecilia. Now, that last name on the death certificate, Bozier, if you say Bozier, it sounds similar to me. So I think someone just wrote it phonetically. So this is a lot of really great information. So this kind of fills out the tree a little bit more. I did include all of these siblings in this, but just because there's not enough room. But here we have Roy and his wife, Claudia, as my great-grandmother. His mother, Lucille, with this mysterious John LaBeouf, who disappeared from record. I've yet to find proof that he died. Maybe he moved away. It's hard to say. If he was in World War I haven't found any evidence of that. So he is still a big mystery. Now we have Louise Lemoyne. So she is born in 1862. She died in 1943. Thomas R. Woods. Now, like I said, he was living in another parish. He actually died in the 1930s. I meant to fill that in. But he's married to another woman. Now, notice on the actual census, it says that this entire family is Black. So I'm thinking that these people are what you would call Creole of color, which I'll get into what that means towards the end. But they're not like super white presenting is what I'm getting at. Thomas, he was, and his wife, she would have been considered a white Creole woman. What's interesting to me is that some of his children with that lady had the same names as his children with Louise, but they're not the same people because they show up on the census having slightly different ages, living in different places in the same census years, not the same people. We also have Cecilia Bozier, so Louise's mother, and her grandmother, who was born in 1810. So this is really awesome. I really love when families like to have multiple generations in a single household. So my next question is, okay, if this is the right family, why would they move? Why would they change their name from LaBeouf to Gonzalez? I will say in Louisiana, Gonzalez is a relatively common name because Louisiana was at one point a Spanish colony as well. There's also a city named Gonzalez. So there's a couple levels to this. What I know of people who would have been considered Creoles of color in this era, if they had a French last name and they looked the way that my great-grandfather looked, people would look at them and assume, okay, you're a Creole of color. But if you have a Spanish last name, there's a little bit more wiggle room with that. At the time when the family would have been moving to New Orleans, legally, if you were considered Mexican, you were legally considered white. So that's something to keep in mind. But the bigger question is, am I even following the right family? So this is where my mother's DNA comes in. Now, we're not going to do a super deep dive into her DNA just because we don't have a whole lot of time, but there are some things I want to point out to you specifically. First being some of her closest matches to that side of the family. So we have this person, EW, who shares 141 centimorgans with my mother. And I mean, while they do have a very small tree, this Thomas Woods, this would be Lucille's brother. They're saying that the common ancestors would be Thomas R. Woods, Lucille's father, and her mother. Now, so this is meant to just show you the relationship between my mother and EW. So this is just one of several of her matches that are close enough to that side of the family to make me think, okay, maybe I'm on the right track here. The next one is somebody that I am calling LA. LA shared 142 centimorgans with my mom, so a decent, an okay amount of shared DNA for how far back we're talking. LA's tree, let's take a look at that. Again, another descendant of Lucille's brother, Thomas. So that puts me in the right place. These are just, so this is the through lines for Catherine Zongi. So that furthest back ancestor from my mother for that side of her family tree. There are matches to all of Louise's siblings too. So these are all things that keep bringing me back to the same family. So that indicates that I'm probably on the right track. But there's still this question of, okay, is there any kind of Spanish heritage in there, right? Looking at her ethnicity estimates, there are no connections to Spain or indigenous Mexico, but we do have some to various African countries. It's such a small percentage that that makes me think that you're going to have multiple generations of people who are Creole of color, so they are considered mixed race, which I'll get into that in a moment. But the other part of the your journeys by parent. So we have Southern Louisiana French settlers, Mississippi Delta. It's only showing this like Southern Louisiana French settlers, this like Southern backcountry Oklahoma and Texas settlers. That doesn't even connect to Texas. Actually, the part of the map that lights up is actually Alabama, which was where Roy's wife was from. So that makes sense. But a little bit of information about that. Historically, Creoles refer to people of French descent born in Louisiana. So that would be your white Creoles. This group of French Louisianans came to dominate New Orleans and just Southern Louisiana in general. They stay connected to France even after becoming an American state. Now, Creole culture itself, it evolved as people from French heritage interacted and had children with people who are of African descent, people who might have been Native American, people also from Spanish cultures as well. So it's very much a melting pot or a pot of gumbo of different things. So it's what the result of that, it really is a unique food culture, unique music culture, and it's very different from anything outside of Louisiana and certainly different from other Southern Gulf states. So this is kind of what I mean by understanding historical context. You really have to understand Creole identity to understand why certain choices were made. So as I said, Creole, historically, though just the word Creole, are people born in Louisiana who are mixed European, African, and or Native American heritage, often speaking French or Creole French. That's what we call people, like all Creole people today. We don't really distinct by Creole or Creole of color, but Creole of color, these are typically mixed race individuals who are descendants of white Creole men. So within one generation of a family being in New Orleans after leaving France, the children of those French colonists, they are considered Creole automatically. Now, Creole of color, that's a little bit more that's a little bit more complicated. So like I said, you have people who are the descendants of white Creole men and African or African descended women. These people are either free people of color or formerly enslaved or currently enslaved women. There's also some instances of Native American or indigenous people in that mix as well. Now, there's something important to keep in mind here. There are two different things regarding Creoles of color. First being placage. So the placage system, this is like an informal union between those white Creole men and free women of color. Those children were provided for financially. They oftentimes were recognized by their white Creole fathers. They were included in wills. They were educated. That is not this family. From what my research has told me, they would have been the result of this up here. White Creole men and enslaved / formerly enslaved women. And the reason why I say that is because we have too many generations of these women who were living in extreme poverty. They were not provided for financially, to the best of my knowledge. And if they were, it was very minimal. The literacy rates were pretty low. So I don't believe any of these women were free women of color. I have not been able to find Louise or any of these other women, her mother, her grandmother, on a census before 1870. I've been looking and I cannot find them. That tells me that they were all born into slavery at some point. I'm looking to see if I can find something to tell me otherwise. But like I said at the beginning of this presentation, this is something that I'm still researching, and it's not an easy thing to research. But these relationships, for the lack of a better word, they're unequal. There is an extreme power imbalance. Even if we're talking about somebody who was formerly enslaved, there is still an extreme power imbalance and a complete lack of social and financial privileges. So the children were Creole, but they were not afforded the same social status as those who were born from placage unions, if that makes sense. Now, when thinking about why Roy will change his name, let's think about this for a moment. The Jim Crow laws in Louisiana, they have been going on for a long time. He was raised under Jim Crow. He got married under Jim Crow. So just to kind of quickly go through these, 1865, 1866, that's when the Black Codes are instituted. So after the Civil War, Louisiana and other southern states passed Black Codes. So these are laws that restricted freedoms of African Americans and Creoles of color. These laws limited their rights to vote, own property, move freely, and this would lay the groundwork for later Jim Crow segregation. Now, by 1877, Reconstruction is over. With the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, white Democrats, they regained control of Louisiana, and this marked the beginning of very aggressive efforts to reestablish white supremacy and enforce racial segregation, which would target Creoles of color as well as African Americans. Now, 1890, the Louisiana Separate Car Act passed. This law mandated that racial segregation on public transportation was mandated. It set the stage for the infamous 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, where Homer Plessy, a Creole of color, challenged the law, leading to the Supreme Court's decision, which was separate but equal ruling. So that legally sanctioned segregation nationwide. And then, of course, 1896, we get Plessy versus Ferguson. 1908, we have the disenfranchisement of Black voters in Louisiana. So Louisiana enacted laws that effectively disenfranchised Black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clause. Creoles of color who had historically been active members of politics, they were largely excluded from voting, diminishing any political power they might have had. Now, by the 1920s into the 30s, we have a hardening of racial boundaries and enforcement of anti-miscegenation, you know what I'm trying to say, laws. Basically, what this would mean is that Creoles of color who once occupied a very distinct social class, they were just increasingly lumped into the category of just Black, as the state adopted this very rigid binary racial system that we were seeing throughout the rest of the country for always. So this would erase their separate identity. And then we have Brown versus Education, 1954. Although the Supreme Court decision declared segregation in public schools constitutional, Louisiana resisted. And it resisted implementation for many years. Creoles of color like other Black Louisianans were affected by the slow pace of desegregation and the lingering social effects of Jim Crow laws. So this is just kind of an overview of how these laws are going to affect Louisiana specifically. And Roy was a young man through a lot of this. I mean, he would have been about 10 years old when this was going on. By 1930, when he is marrying my great-grandmother, he is somebody who at the time would have been considered Black, but he was passing for white. And then he married a white lady who was born in Alabama and grew up in Mississippi. He was living a dangerous life. So putting that into context, Jim Crow would have touched him in every aspect of his life, his marriage, his work, all of it. Because Roy didn't share these details with my grandmother, there's no way of knowing for sure specifically why the name Gonzalez was chosen for the family. But I believe that the name Gonzalez was used partially as a cover story, which would include that Roy's father was the Spaniard from Spain. Choosing to start to identify as white, also known as passing, it was risky. It was very dangerous on many levels. Best case scenario, at the time when he married my great-grandmother, best case scenario, he went to prison. Worst case scenario would be death. Let's not sugarcoat that at all. Passing was often considered a last resort response to racial oppression in the early decades of the 20th century. Even though passing gave Creoles more opportunities, making that choice would have been emotionally strenuous because of you're treading kind of a dangerous line of possibly being found out, and what will those consequences be? I will say, in many ways, Roy had his own privilege. He was actually able to pass. Oftentimes, many people who were passing, they would have to cut off ties from the rest of the family. And in some ways, I think that happened because there are all these cousins of my grandmother that she had that their descendants today still live in St. James Parish or St. John the Baptist, and they don't look like me. They look darker complected. They look Black. They don't look like someone like Roy or my grandmother who could pass. So they were a little bit more privileged in that respect, but that's just luck of the draw, if you ask me. Now, even though by the end of Roy's life, he would have been familiar with a law that would have passed in 1970 that created a legal mathematical formula for determining race. Gotta love Louisiana. Essentially, anyone who had 1/32 or less African ancestry cannot be designated by a public office as colored, mulatto, or Black. Before 1970, the standard of defining someone as Black was if they had trace amounts of Black ancestry. This was also called the incredibly oppressive one-drop rule. So even someone like my mother, who was a redhead, and I mean, my mother gets sunburned inside. Legally, she would have actually, until the 70s, been considered Black, which is wild to me, but that's just how the law was. So like I said, we might never truly know the exact reasons why Roy's family made these choices, but when we put it into this broader historical context of racial discrimination, the legal constraints, and just social mobility in the early 20th century, this likely influenced their decision to change the name and create a new origin story for the family. Now, when I told my grandmother the story, when I finally started to puzzle it out, I was kind of expecting her to not react well because she was a woman born in the 30s in the South, and she always believed that she was white, that her father was entirely white, because she had that upbringing. But she actually was excited when I told her because she said it gave her new context for who her father was. He wasn't always the best father. He was not always the best husband, for sure. He was an excellent grandfather and great-grandfather. And this is actually my sister right here. He passed away before I was born. But as a parent, he was not great, and he was just so secretive. I mean, he told my mother that, when I die, I don't want you to put an obituary in the paper for me because I don't want people showing up at my funeral looking for handouts. That's the kind of man this was. So it made her understand a little bit more before she passed away who her father was and why he was the way he was. So that's just kind of the end of my presentation now. I hope you all got some ideas from this. of how to maybe use these three things, DNA, oral history, and just kind of broader historical context, to climb over that brick wall. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope you have a good day.